Welcome everyone. Tonight, I want to invite you to step quietly into a world that rarely makes it into history books or glossy films. A world without spotlights, without jazz-age glamour, and without the comforting myth that the past was simpler or kinder. Today's story is about being a single woman in 1930s America, not as an idea, not as a stereotype, but as a lived, daily reality. When people think of the 1930s, they often picture breadlines, dust storms, and men in worn hats searching for work. Women appear in the background, if at all smiling secretaries, patient wives, or Hollywood starlets shimmering on black and white screens. But hidden behind those images was another group entirely, millions of unmarried women navigating a society that saw them not as independent individuals, but as unfinished stories. To be a single woman in 1930s America was not merely a personal circumstance. It was a social condition, an economic risk, and in many eyes, a quiet failure. Marriage was not just encouraged. It was assumed. A woman without a husband was expected to explain herself politely, repeatedly, and without irritation. Why was not she married yet? What had gone wrong? Was she too particular, too ambitious, too something? This pressure did not come only from family. It came from landlords, employers, neighbors, shopkeepers, and strangers who felt entitled to comment on a woman's life simply because she lived it alone. Independence was not celebrated. It was tolerated at best, questioned at worst. Economically, the odds were stacked from the start. Jobs available to women were limited, poorly paid, and often explicitly temporary. Many employers believed a woman's paycheck was supplemental, not essential, a misunderstanding that could mean the difference between rent and eviction. Secretarial work, factory labor, shop assistants, domestic service, these roles demanded long hours and offered little security. Raises were rare. Advancement was rarer. And the unspoken rule hovered over every desk: do not get married, or you will be replaced. Yet remaining single was hardly safer. Without a husband's income, many women lived one missed paycheck away from crisis. Saving money was nearly impossible when wages barely covered food and rent. Medical care was a luxury. New clothes were fantasies. Even leisure came with a price, financial and social. Respectability mattered deeply in this world. A single woman had to appear modest but not dull, capable but not threatening, friendly but not inviting. Every choice was scrutinized: how she dressed, where she lived, when she came home, who she spoke to, and how loudly she laughed. Too quiet, and she was pitied. Too visible, and she was judged. Living arrangements reflected this tension. Boarding houses became the backbone of survival for many single women. Shared rooms, shared kitchens, shared bathrooms, and shared rules. Privacy was scarce. Autonomy was limited. Landladies often enforced curfews and codes of behavior meant to protect reputation, though they also served to control and monitor. A woman's personal life was never entirely her own. And then there was the word that hovered like a shadow: spinster. By modern standards, it sounds outdated, even quaint. In the 1930s, it carried real weight. A woman in her mid-20s could already be whispered about. By 30, the label stuck. Spinsterhood implied not just singleness, but something colder: an assumption of loneliness, bitterness, or failure to attract a husband. The irony, of course, is that many of these women were not weak or helpless. They were resilient, resourceful, and determined. They learned how to stretch a dollar, how to repair clothing until it barely resembled its original form, how to negotiate space in crowded rooms, and how to endure judgment without letting it harden them completely. Still, resilience does not erase pressure. The constant reminder that society valued women primarily as wives weighed heavily. Even success carried an expiration date. A woman could be praised for her work ethic, her reliability, her skill, but only until marriage entered the conversation. Then, suddenly, her ambition became temporary, her competence replaceable. Romantic independence was equally complicated. Dating was governed by rigid, often contradictory rules. A woman was expected to want marriage, but not too eagerly. She was meant to attract interest, but not invite gossip. She could accept attention, but never appeared to seek it. Every interaction existed under a microscope. In public spaces, single women were rarely invisible. Walking alone invited commentary. Dining alone raised eyebrows. Living alone was often impossible. Society had decided that a woman by herself was either incomplete or suspect, and sometimes both. And yet, within these constraints, single women carved out lives that mattered. They formed friendships that became families. They shared resources, advice, and quiet humor. They created meaning in small victories, a paid bill, a repaired shoe, a laugh at the end of a long day. Their lives were not empty simply because they were unmarried, they were full in ways society refused to measure. This is the brutal reality often left out of nostalgic retellings of the past. Being a single woman in 1930s America meant standing at the intersection of economic vulnerability and social judgment, expected to survive quietly and gratefully, without complaint. It meant being strong without recognition, independent without validation, and hopeful in a world that offered little reassurance. Tonight's story is not about glamour or romance. It is about endurance. About the daily courage required to exist outside the narrow path society laid down. And as we move deeper into this world, we will see that survival was not just about money or shelter, it was about identity, dignity, and the stubborn refusal to disappear. So settle in. This is not the America of movie screens and dance halls. This is the America of shared rooms, tight budgets, and quiet strength. And this is the story of the women who lived there single, scrutinized, and unbreakable. Boarding houses became the backbone of survival for countless single women in 1930s America. With wages collapsing and jobs scarce during the Great Depression, independent living was no longer realistic for most working women. Renting a private apartment was a luxury few could afford. So boarding houses, often aging buildings subdivided into small rented rooms, became the default option. These spaces were not temporary stops for many women. They were long-term environments where daily life, dignity, and survival were constantly negotiated. Rooms were typically small, sparsely furnished, and utilitarian. A narrow bed, a shared dresser, a single chair, and perhaps a small wash basin constituted the entirety of one's personal domain. Walls were thin, doors rarely locked securely, and personal space existed more as an idea than a reality. Every sound traveled: footsteps in the hallway, coughing from the next room, whispered conversations late at night. Privacy was not expected, and solitude was considered indulgent. Most boarding houses were organized around rigid schedules. Wake-up times, meal hours, bathing access, and curfews were strictly enforced. These rules were not merely about order. They were about control. Landladies, often older women who ran the houses, saw themselves as guardians of morality as much as property managers. A woman returning late at night, receiving visitors, or violating unspoken codes of behavior could quickly become the subject of suspicion or reprimand. Shared facilities shaped the rhythm of daily life. Bathrooms were communal, sometimes serving 10 or more women. Hot water was limited, and morning routines became silent competitions. Women learned to wake earlier than necessary just to secure a few minutes of warm water. Miss the window, and the rest of the day began with cold water, damp towels, and frustration. Hygiene became a matter of strategy rather than comfort. Kitchens, when available, were similarly crowded. Some boarding houses provided meals, while others allowed limited cooking privileges. In houses that served food, meals were eaten at long tables under watchful eyes. Portions were modest, menus repetitive, and leftovers rare. Food scarcity sharpened social tension. A missing slice of bread or an extra spoonful of jam could spark quiet resentment. Yet these shared meals also created fragile bonds. Moments of unspoken understanding among women who knew that everyone at the table was struggling in her own way. Noise was constant. Radios played in common rooms, footsteps echoed in hallways, and arguments sometimes muted, sometimes not filtered through walls. For women who worked long hours in offices, factories, or shops, there was no true refuge at the end of the day. The boarding house was not a sanctuary but an extension of public life, where one was always visible, always observed. Despite this, many women adapted with remarkable resilience. They learned how to carve out psychological privacy where physical privacy did not exist. A book read under a dim lamp, a quiet letter written late at night, or a few minutes of silence before sleep became acts of quiet resistance. Personal routines, no matter how small, offered a sense of identity in an environment that constantly threatened to erase it. Social hierarchies formed quickly within boarding houses. Long-term residents often held unspoken authority over newcomers. Age, employment stability, and perceived respectability influenced status. A woman with a steady office job might be treated with subtle deference, while someone between jobs could face thinly veiled judgment. Gossip functioned as both entertainment and enforcement, reinforcing norms about behavior, appearance, and ambition. Emotional isolation was common. Many women lived far from family, having moved to cities in search of work. Letters from home were treasured, reread until the paper wore thin. Yet returning home was rarely an option. Families themselves were struggling, and a single woman was often expected to remain self-sufficient, no matter the cost. The boarding house, with all its constraints, represented independence of a fragile kind. At the same time, these environments fostered unexpected solidarity. Women shared advice about employers, warned each other about unsafe streets, and quietly supported those who fell ill or lost work. A borrowed coat, a shared meal, or a discreet word of encouragement could mean the difference between despair and endurance. These acts rarely made history, but they sustained lives. Boarding houses also served as spaces where the contradictions of the era were most visible. Society valued women's labor but paid them poorly. It demanded moral purity while offering little security. It celebrated marriage as salvation while providing no alternative framework for women who remained single. Within the narrow rooms and shared halls of boarding houses, these tensions played out daily. For many single women, life in a boarding house was not merely about housing, it was about navigating a world that offered limited choices and constant judgment. Every day required negotiation: how to dress, how to speak, when to be invisible, and when to assert oneself. Survival depended not only on wages but on adaptability, restraint, and emotional endurance. These women were not passive victims of circumstance. They were active participants in their own survival, making calculated decisions within tight constraints. The boarding house was both a symbol of limitation and a testament to perseverance. It reflected a society in crisis, but also the quiet strength of women who refused to disappear despite being given so little space. Through overcrowded rooms, shared hardships, and unrelenting scrutiny, single women in 1930s America built lives that history often overlooks. Their stories unfold not in grand gestures, but in daily compromises, small victories, and the relentless effort to maintain dignity in a world that rarely acknowledged it. Mourning in a 1930s boarding house was not a quiet transition from sleep to work. It was a daily test of timing, endurance, and self-discipline, shaped entirely by scarcity. For single women living under one roof, the day began not with personal intention, but with the collective pressure of shared facilities and limited resources. The moment one woman rose, others followed, because being late meant losing access to the basics required to face the outside world. Bathrooms were the most contested spaces. In many houses, a single bathroom served 8, 10, sometimes even more women. Hot water was rationed by infrastructure rather than fairness. Once it ran out, it did not return quickly. Women learned this early. Those who could afford it set alarms well before dawn, not because their jobs demanded it, but because hygiene depended on it. To arrive at work clean and presentable was not optional. It was a condition of being taken seriously. The routines that formed around this reality were precise. Shoes were placed beside the bed the night before. Clothes were folded carefully to avoid unnecessary noise. A woman learned to dress quickly, quietly, efficiently, because every minute mattered. Lingering was not just inconsiderate, it was risky. One missed opportunity could ripple through the entire day. Inside the bathroom, time was compressed. Washing was rushed. Hair was pinned up while still damp. Mirrors were shared, and glances were brief. There was little room for vanity, but no tolerance for neglect. Cleanliness was not about comfort. It was about survival in a society that equated a woman's worth with her appearance. To look unkempt was to invite judgment, suspicion, and potentially dismissal from work. The lack of privacy intensified everything. Conversations happened through doors. Footsteps in the hallway signaled urgency. Knocks were firm, sometimes impatient. No one needed to speak openly. The system enforced itself. Every woman knew she was both observer and observed, participant and obstacle. This constant awareness shaped behavior, teaching restraint and emotional control at an early hour. Personal grooming tools were minimal. A shared sink often meant limited space for toiletries. Many women owned only the essentials: a comb, a small mirror, soap, perhaps a modest cosmetic item reserved for special occasions. Items were reused carefully. Nothing was wasted. Even water left in a basin might be repurposed. Resourcefulness was not a virtue celebrated publicly, but it was quietly practiced everywhere. Clothing choices were made under pressure. Stockings were fragile and expensive, frequently repaired rather than replaced. Shoes were worn until they could no longer be fixed. Dresses were rotated strategically to give the impression of variety. Morning dressing became an exercise in presentation rather than self-expression. The goal was not to stand out, but to blend seamlessly into expectations. Silence often dominated these early hours. Not because women lacked conversation, but because energy had to be conserved. Words were saved for the workplace, where politeness and composure were required for wages. In the boarding house, mornings were transactional. One woman exited a space so another could enter. Cooperation existed, but it was unspoken, fragile, and dependent on mutual understanding. The emotional toll of this routine accumulated slowly. Starting every day in competition, even subtle competition, shaped how women saw themselves and each other. There was rarely open conflict, but tension lingered. Frustration had to be swallowed. Anger had nowhere to go. A woman learned to internalize stress before she even stepped outside. Breakfast, when available, was often hurried. Some boarding houses provided it. Others did not. For those that did, timing again mattered. Being late meant smaller portions or none at all. Meals were simple, repetitive, designed to stretch limited budgets. Yet even this modest nourishment was critical. Many women worked long hours on empty stomachs when food ran short. The physical act of leaving the house marked a shift. Once outside, the individual disappeared into the city, carrying the weight of the morning with her. But the boarding house did not release its hold. The habits learned there: efficiency, vigilance, self-monitoring followed women into offices, factories, and shops. Morning routines trained them to endure environments where control was external and resources scarce. What made these mornings particularly difficult was their invisibility. To employers, co-workers, and passers-by, a woman arrived at work looking composed or tired, but the effort behind that appearance went unseen. No one counted the minutes spent waiting for hot water or the anxiety of falling behind schedule. These struggles were private, normalized, and therefore dismissed. Yet within this repetition, women developed resilience. Mastery of the morning became a quiet form of power. Knowing how to move quickly, adapt, and prepare with limited means was a skill earned through necessity. Over time, routines became almost automatic, allowing women to preserve a sense of control where little else existed. These mornings also reinforced a deeper truth about life for single women in the 1930s. Independence came at a cost. Freedom from family oversight or marriage did not mean freedom from constraint. Instead, it meant navigating systems that offered autonomy in theory but demanded constant compromise in practice. Every day began with calculation. How early to rise? What could be skipped? What absolutely could not? The morning routine was not simply preparation for work, it was preparation for visibility in a society that scrutinized women relentlessly. To step outside was to present proof of respectability, effort, and discipline. Over time, the routine shaped identity. Women became known for punctuality, neatness, and endurance, traits praised but rarely rewarded. These qualities were assumed rather than acknowledged. Still, they formed the backbone of survival, allowing women to hold on to employment, dignity, and a fragile sense of self-worth. The morning hours in a boarding house reveal more than logistical hardship. They expose the quiet labor required just to exist as a single woman during the Great Depression. Before wages were earned, before words were spoken, the day demanded resilience. And every morning, without recognition or relief, women met that demand. Clothing in 1930s America carried weight far beyond fabric. For single working women, what they wore was read as a moral statement, a measure of discipline, and a signal of employability. In a society quick to judge and slow to forgive, appearance became a form of protection. Dressing properly was not about fashion or personal taste. It was about avoiding suspicion and maintaining access to work in a fragile economy. Most single women owned very little. A small wardrobe was typical, perhaps 2 or 3 dresses suitable for work, 1 coat, a single pair of everyday shoes, and another pair reserved for better occasions. Each item had to perform multiple roles and last far longer than intended. Clothing was selected not for comfort, but for durability and discretion. Neutral colors were favored because they hid wear and could be reused without drawing attention. Mending was a routine skill rather than a hobby. Stockings were repaired repeatedly, tiny stitches extending their life week by week. Hems were let down as fabric thinned. Buttons were saved, reused, and shared among residents. A loose seam was addressed immediately, because a visibly damaged garment could be interpreted as carelessness, or worse, instability. To appear unkempt risked more than embarrassment. It threatened livelihood. The act of dressing each morning was deliberate. A woman assessed what she wore the day before, what others might remember, and how often an outfit could be repeated without comment. Variety was simulated through small adjustments: a different collar, a carefully pressed skirt, a belt repositioned. These subtle changes required attention and effort, but they allowed women to present consistency without monotony. Cleanliness mattered as much as style. Even when hot water was scarce and laundry access limited, women did everything possible to ensure clothes appeared freshly cared for. Washing was often done by hand, late at night, using shared sinks or small basins. Items were hung discreetly to dry, sometimes hidden to avoid drawing notice or violating house rules. Ironing, when possible, transformed worn fabric into something respectable. Shoes presented a particular challenge. Good footwear was expensive and essential, especially for women who walked long distances to work. Soles wore thin quickly, heels loosened, and repairs cost money that was often unavailable. Many women learned to walk carefully, conserving their shoes as if they were fragile instruments. A damaged shoe could undermine an entire outfit, regardless of how carefully the rest was maintained. Hair and grooming were equally important. Hairstyles had to be neat, practical, and in line with expectations of modesty. Excessive styling risked being labeled frivolous, while neglect invited judgment. Cosmetics were used sparingly. A touch of powder, perhaps lipstick applied lightly, was enough to signal effort without excess. Anything more could be misinterpreted, especially in conservative workplaces. The pressure to appear respectable followed women everywhere. On the street, strangers assessed them in passing. At work, supervisors and co-workers took note. In boarding houses, landladies and fellow residents observed patterns and changes. A woman who suddenly dressed differently might prompt questions. Appearance was a language everyone understood, and deviations were quickly noticed. Workplace expectations intensified this scrutiny. Office jobs, though poorly paid, demanded a specific look. Clean lines, subdued colors, and consistency signaled reliability. Employers often expected women to look polished while providing wages barely sufficient to maintain that standard. The cost of meeting these expectations was absorbed quietly by the women themselves. Clothing also shaped interactions among women. In boarding houses and offices, subtle hierarchies formed around perceived neatness and quality of dress. A woman whose coat looked newer might be assumed to earn more or have family support. Someone whose clothes showed wear might face unspoken pity or judgment. These assumptions were rarely accurate, but they influenced social dynamics nonetheless. The emotional burden of this constant evaluation was heavy. Dressing became a daily performance, one that allowed little room for authenticity. Clothing had to conceal exhaustion, worry, and frustration. Even on difficult days, a woman was expected to present composure. There was no visible allowance for struggle. Yet within these constraints, women exercised agency. They learned how to use what they had with intelligence and care. Creativity flourished quietly in clever alterations, in careful coordination, in the pride taken from making something worn look presentable. These acts were small, but they reinforced a sense of competence and control. Hand-me-downs and shared resources played a role. Sisters, friends, and sometimes fellow boarders exchanged clothing discreetly. These exchanges were governed by trust and necessity. Borrowing was not casual. It was strategic. A coat lent during winter or a dress shared for an interview could carry significant meaning. Such gestures created bonds rooted in survival rather than sentimentality. Seasonal changes heightened challenges. Winter demanded layers and warmth that many wardrobes lacked. Summer exposed fabric to sweat and wear, making cleanliness harder to maintain. Each season required adjustment, repair, and compromise. Clothing was not static. It evolved constantly under pressure. Public spaces amplified expectations. Riding public transportation or walking through commercial districts placed women under anonymous scrutiny. A well-dressed appearance offered a measure of safety and legitimacy. It signaled that a woman belonged in public space, that she was purposeful and respectable. Without it, she risked unwanted attention or dismissal. The irony was stark. Society judged women harshly based on appearance while offering them limited means to meet those standards. Respectability was demanded but rarely supported. Women bore the cost financially and emotionally, navigating a system that treated presentation as both requirement and weapon. Despite this, many women found dignity in their effort. Dressing well, within constraints, became an affirmation of self-respect. It was a way of asserting worth in an environment that frequently denied it. Even when no one acknowledged the labor involved, the act itself mattered. Clothing also served as a reminder of aspiration. A carefully kept dress represented the hope of stability, perhaps advancement. It symbolized participation in a world that promised opportunity, even when reality fell short. Each repaired seam and pressed fold carried quiet determination. In the end, dressing for respectability was not vanity. It was labor unpaid, unrecognized, and essential. It allowed single women to navigate workplaces, streets, and social spaces with a measure of security. Through fabric and thread, they negotiated visibility and survival. These daily choices reveal how deeply appearance was tied to power. For single women in the 1930s, clothing was armor. It did not eliminate hardship, but it reduced risk. And every morning, as dresses were fastened and shoes carefully worn, Women prepared not just for work, but for judgment in a world that watched closely and gave little grace. Meals inside boarding houses were never just about food. They were structured moments where survival, observation, and social dynamics collided. For single women in 1930s America, shared meals, especially breakfast and dinner, functioned as both necessity and test. These gatherings revealed hierarchy, enforced discipline, and quietly reinforced the rules that governed daily life. In many boarding houses, meals were included in rent, making them essential for women whose wages barely covered basic expenses. Food security depended on punctuality and compliance. Arriving late meant smaller portions or none at all. This reality shaped behavior long before anyone sat down at the table. Women adjusted their schedules to ensure they were present, even if exhaustion made eating difficult. Dining rooms were typically modest and utilitarian. Long tables, closely spaced chairs, and minimal decoration created an atmosphere focused on efficiency rather than comfort. Seating was often informal but predictable. Over time, women gravitated toward the same spots, forming unspoken patterns that reflected familiarity and status. A favored seat near a window or closer to the serving area carried subtle significance. The food itself was simple and repetitive. Meals were designed to stretch budgets, not satisfy preference. Bread, porridge, eggs, and basic stews appeared frequently. Fresh fruit or variety was rare. Portions were measured carefully. Waste was discouraged, and leftovers were tightly controlled. Complaints were not welcome. Gratitude, or at least silence, was expected. Conversation at the table followed an unwritten code. Topics stayed safe. Work schedules, weather, minor observations. Personal matters were shared selectively. Oversharing invited scrutiny, while silence could be interpreted as aloofness. Every word carried weight, because information traveled quickly within confined spaces. A careless comment could circulate through the house by evening. Landladies often presided over meals, either directly or indirectly. Their presence reinforced order. They observed attendance, demeanor, and behavior, noting who followed rules and who tested boundaries. Meals became moments of informal assessment. A woman who skipped too often, ate too little, or appeared distracted might raise questions about her employment or conduct. This environment encouraged self-monitoring. Women learned to regulate not only what they said, but how they ate. Appetite was managed to avoid appearing either desperate or ungrateful. Eating too quickly could signal hunger. Eating too slowly might draw attention. The body itself became something to manage publicly. Despite these constraints, shared meals also fostered connection. Over time, familiarity bred quiet understanding. Women noticed patterns in each other's lives: fatigue, mood changes, absence. Concern was expressed indirectly, through small gestures rather than open discussion. An extra slice of bread passed discreetly, a cup refilled without comment, a seat saved for someone running late. Gossip, however, was inevitable. Confined living created an environment where speculation filled gaps left by silence. Who received letters regularly? Who returned late at night? Who seemed anxious about work? Gossip functioned as both entertainment and regulation, reinforcing norms and discouraging deviation. While often unkind, it also reflected collective anxiety in uncertain times. Meals highlighted inequality even among women facing similar hardships. A woman with a slightly better coat or steadier job might be treated with subtle deference. Someone newly arrived or recently unemployed might feel the shift in tone immediately. These distinctions were rarely explicit, but they shaped social dynamics at the table. Economic pressure sharpened these interactions. Hunger was not always visible, but it was present. Women learned to eat enough to sustain themselves while concealing scarcity. Pride and necessity coexisted, uneasily. Accepting help required trust, and offering it required discretion. Mutual aid thrived in small, quiet ways rather than open generosity. Meals also marked time. In a day structured by work and rules, breakfast and dinner provided anchors. They signaled routine and predictability in an otherwise unstable world. For women far from family, these moments replaced traditional household gatherings, though stripped of warmth and privacy. Evenings were particularly charged. After long workdays, fatigue lowered tolerance. Conversations grew shorter. Tension, when present, was harder to mask. Yet outright conflict was rare. Women knew the cost of disruption. Harmony, however fragile, was a form of security. The emotional weight of these meals accumulated slowly. Eating under observation, day after day, reinforced a sense of being constantly evaluated. There was little space to relax fully. Yet women adapted, learning when to engage and when to retreat. Emotional intelligence became a survival skill. Over time, shared meals created a collective memory. Women remembered who arrived during difficult winters, who left abruptly, who never returned after losing work. These absences were noted quietly, acknowledged without ceremony. Life moved on, but the table held traces of those who passed through. In moments of crisis, the dining room could become a site of solidarity. Illness, job loss, or emotional strain prompted subtle shifts in behavior. Rules bent slightly. Portions stretched. Silence softened. These moments revealed the humanity beneath the structure, reminding women that they were not entirely alone. Yet the system remained firm. Meals reinforced dependence on the boarding house and its rules. They reminded women of the limits placed on their autonomy. Food was both sustenance and leverage, offered within a framework of compliance. Through shared meals, single women learned to navigate visibility, hierarchy, and cooperation. They balanced self-preservation with community, caution with kindness. These daily rituals, ordinary and repetitive, shaped character as much as circumstance. In the end, the dining table reflected the broader reality of single women's lives during the Great Depression. It was a place of nourishment and negotiation, connection and control. Within its narrow boundaries, women learned how to endure together, yet always aware of the fragile balance that held their world in place. Leaving the boarding house did not mean leaving hardship behind. For single women in 1930s America, the commute to work was a demanding extension of daily labor, unpaid, unacknowledged, and unavoidable. City streets presented physical obstacles, social tension, and emotional strain that tested endurance long before a workday officially began. Most women traveled on foot or relied on crowded public transportation. Private automobiles were rare, and fares, though small, added up quickly. Walking was often the most economical choice, even when distances were long and weather unforgiving. Rain-soaked coats that took days to dry. Winter winds cut through thin fabric. Summer heat clung to streets lined with concrete and exhaust. Each season imposed its own burden. Sidewalks were uneven and poorly maintained. Puddles, broken paving stones, and crowded crossings demanded constant attention. A misstep could mean damaged shoes or stained clothing, costly setbacks when replacements were out of reach. Women learned to walk carefully, balancing speed with caution, because arriving late or disheveled carried consequences at work. Public transportation offered little relief. Streetcars and buses were often overcrowded, especially during peak hours. Seats were limited, and standing was common. Personal space disappeared as bodies pressed together. For women already accustomed to communal living, this was familiar, but no less exhausting. Holding oneself upright while protecting clothing and belongings required physical effort and alertness. Harassment was an unspoken but persistent presence. Unwanted comments, lingering stares, and subtle intrusions were part of the commute. Responses had to be calculated. Ignoring behavior was often safer than confronting it. Drawing attention risked escalation or public embarrassment. Women learned to maintain neutral expressions, eyes forward, posture composed, signals intended to discourage interaction. The emotional labor of this vigilance was significant. Each journey required mental preparation. Routes were chosen strategically to avoid poorly lit areas or known trouble spots. Timing mattered. Leaving too early or too late could increase vulnerability. These decisions were made daily, often unconsciously, but they shaped movement through the city. The commute also exposed economic realities starkly. Women passed storefronts displaying goods they could not afford, offices where better paid workers entered, neighborhoods that marked social divides. The contrast reinforced awareness of one's position within the city's hierarchy. Public space became a reminder of limitation as much as opportunity. Despite these challenges, commuting offered moments of autonomy. The streets, however demanding, allowed movement beyond the confines of boarding houses. For some women, walking provided rare solitude. Brief stretches between buildings offered space to think, plan, or simply exist without immediate supervision. These moments were small, but meaningful. Time pressure dominated the experience. Being late threatened wages and reputation. Public transportation delays, weather disruptions, or unexpected obstacles had real consequences. Women learned to build buffers into their routines, leaving earlier than necessary to account for uncertainty. This constant anticipation of disruption added to daily fatigue. Workplaces often failed to acknowledge the effort required to arrive on time. Employers expected punctuality without considering distance, conditions, or cost. Tardiness was interpreted as irresponsibility rather than circumstance. Women absorbed this pressure quietly, knowing that explanations rarely changed outcomes. Clothing choices were influenced by commuting realities. Practicality often overrode comfort. Coats had to be warm enough for winter walks yet presentable for the office. Shoes needed to withstand long distances while appearing professional. These compromises shaped appearance and movement, reinforcing the connection between labor and presentation. The commute also served as a social filter. Women observed others who shared similar paths, familiar faces seen daily at crossings or on streetcars. These silent communities formed through routine rather than interaction. Recognition without conversation created a sense of belonging that required no words. Danger was not always dramatic, but it was persistent. Poor lighting, isolated stretches, and unpredictable encounters required awareness. Women developed strategies, walking confidently, avoiding eye contact, keeping pace with groups when possible. These behaviors became second nature, integrated into movement itself. Weather amplified vulnerability. Snow slowed transit and obscured hazards. Rain increased crowding indoors and reduced visibility. Heat exhausted bodies already strained by long hours. Each condition demanded adjustment, reinforcing adaptability as a core skill. Despite hardship, women demonstrated resilience. They learned the city's rhythms, identified safer routes, and managed time with precision. Mastery of the commute became a quiet achievement, evidence of competence in an environment that offered little support. The psychological impact of daily travel accumulated. Starting and ending each workday with exertion left little energy for rest or leisure. Commutes extended the workday beyond paid hours, compressing personal time. Exhaustion became normalized. Yet these journeys also symbolized participation in public life. Being seen moving purposefully through the city asserted presence. It signaled contribution, independence, and determination. For women whose roles were often minimized, simply occupying space mattered. Over time, the commute shaped identity. Endurance, alertness, and adaptability became ingrained traits. These qualities were rarely recognized, but they sustained livelihoods and self-respect. The city demanded much, and women met those demands daily. The act of traveling to work revealed the imbalance between expectation and support. Society relied on women's labor while overlooking the effort required to perform it. Streets, transportation systems, and workplaces were not designed with their needs in mind. Still, women navigated these spaces with skill and resolve. They learned when to hurry, when to wait, and when to blend into crowds. These decisions were constant, shaping each journey. In the end, the commute was not merely a path between home and work. It was a proving ground. Each day, women faced the city and persisted. Through crowded streets and uncertain conditions, they claimed mobility and purpose in a world that often sought to limit both. These daily journeys underscore the quiet strength of single women during the Great Depression. Their resilience unfolded step by step, unnoticed yet essential, as they crossed the city again and again, moving forward despite the weight of circumstance. Work was supposed to justify the sacrifices single women made each day. It was the reason for crowded boarding houses, exhausting commutes, and carefully maintained appearances. Yet for many women in 1930s America, the workplace offered little relief. Instead, it became another environment defined by imbalance where expectations were high, wages were low, and security was always uncertain. Most single women found employment in offices, shops, factories, or domestic service. Office work, in particular, carried social prestige, even though the pay rarely matched the image. Typing pools, clerical desks, and reception areas were filled with women whose labor kept businesses functioning smoothly. Accuracy, speed, and obedience were demanded without question. Mistakes were noticed immediately. Excellence was assumed. Wages reflected this imbalance. Pay was often just enough to cover rent and food, leaving little margin for emergencies. Raises were rare and small. Women were expected to be grateful for employment at all, especially during the Great Depression, when joblessness was widespread. The threat of replacement was constant. Employers knew there were many others waiting for the same position. Job security was fragile by design. Single women were often hired with the assumption that their employment was temporary, a placeholder until marriage. This belief shaped workplace culture. Long-term advancement was rarely discussed. Training focused on efficiency rather than growth. A woman who appeared ambitious risked being labeled difficult or unrealistic. Marriage, paradoxically, was treated as both an expectation and a liability. In many offices, women were discouraged or even required to leave once they married. Employers justified this by claiming married women should be supported by their husbands, or that jobs should go to men with families. As a result, single women walked a narrow line. Too independent, and they appeared threatening. Too marriage-minded, and they seemed unreliable. Daily work routines were rigid. Hours were long, breaks were brief, and supervision was constant. Managers monitored productivity closely. Typing speed, filing accuracy, and punctuality were measured relentlessly. Surveillance was subtle but pervasive. A woman learned quickly that being watched was part of the job. The emotional labor required was significant. Women were expected to remain pleasant, composed, and accommodating regardless of stress. Fatigue, frustration, or personal difficulty had no place at the desk. A calm demeanor was part of professional competence. Complaints were discouraged, and vulnerability was often interpreted as weakness. Workplace hierarchies reinforced inequality. Male supervisors held authority, while women filled subordinate roles with limited decision-making power. Instructions flowed downward, rarely upward. Even highly capable women were excluded from discussions that shaped policy or direction. Their expertise was valued only within narrow boundaries. Competition among women was quietly encouraged. Limited opportunities created an environment where comparison was inevitable. Praise for one worker could be perceived as a threat to another. While cooperation existed, it was tempered by awareness that any misstep could cost a job. Solidarity had to coexist with self-preservation. Office etiquette reinforced conformity. Dress codes, speech patterns, and behavior were tightly regulated. A woman's appearance was scrutinized alongside her performance. Looking tired or distracted could invite criticism. Maintaining composure required effort, especially after long commutes and restless nights. The fear of dismissal loomed constantly. Economic downturns led to sudden layoffs, often with little warning. Women were frequently the first to go. Being single offered no protection. In fact, it sometimes made women more expendable in the eyes of employers. Losing a job meant immediate instability, as savings were minimal and alternatives scarce. Yet work also provided structure and identity. For many women, employment represented independence, however limited. Earning wages, even modest ones, allowed a degree of autonomy not available within traditional family roles. This autonomy came at a price, but it mattered deeply. Routine offered predictability. Filing papers, answering phones, or serving customers created a rhythm that anchored daily life. In a world marked by uncertainty, routine was comforting. It provided a sense of purpose, even when recognition was absent. Interactions with coworkers formed an important social network. Lunchtime conversations, shared frustrations, and mutual assistance built connections. These relationships were often cautious but meaningful. A colleague who shared advice or covered a mistake could make the difference between keeping and losing a job. Workplaces also reinforced social norms. Expectations around femininity, obedience, and modesty were ever present. Women learned which behaviors were rewarded and which were penalized. Assertiveness had to be carefully calibrated. Confidence could be mistaken for defiance if not expressed gently. The gap between effort and reward was stark. Women arrived early, stayed late, and maintained high standards, yet advancement remained limited. Promotions were rare and often symbolic. Recognition, when given, rarely translated into improved conditions. Despite this, many women took pride in their competence. Mastery of tasks, reliability, and professionalism became sources of self-worth. These qualities were cultivated intentionally, serving as proof of capability in an environment that offered little affirmation. Work also shaped long-term outlooks. The realization that stability was uncertain influenced decisions about savings, relationships, and future plans. Many women delayed major commitments, aware that a single setback could undo years of effort. The workplace mirrored broader societal contradictions. Women's labor was essential but undervalued. Their presence was welcomed but constrained. Independence was permitted but not fully supported. These tensions played out daily, shaping experience and expectation. Fatigue accumulated over time. Long hours, emotional restraint, and constant vigilance drained energy. Leisure was limited. Rest was incomplete. Yet endurance became normalized, a quiet expectation rather than an acknowledged burden. Still, women persisted. They adapted to changing demands, learned new skills, and navigated office politics with care. Their resilience sustained institutions that rarely credited them for it. Inside offices and shops across America, single women held together the fabric of everyday business. Their contributions were steady, often invisible, and indispensable. They worked under pressure, with little security, and few rewards but with determination. The workplace, like the boarding house and the street, was a site of negotiation. Every day required choices about compliance, resistance, and survival. Through these choices, women carved out a measure of agency, however constrained. This reality reveals a deeper truth. Employment did not erase hardship for single women in the 1930s. It reorganized it. Work offered income and identity, but it also demanded sacrifice and silence. And within those limits, women continued showing up, performing, enduring, holding their place in a system that relied on them while giving little in return. Behind the doors of many boarding houses stood a figure who shaped daily life as much as any employer: the landlady. Her authority extended far beyond rent collection. In 1930s America, she functioned as supervisor, gatekeeper, and moral referee, enforcing social expectations in ways that profoundly affected single women's sense of freedom and security. Landladies were often older women who had carved out economic survival by managing boarding houses. They operated within tight margins, balancing expenses, reputations, and social scrutiny. Respectability was not optional. It was essential to keeping their business afloat. As a result, maintaining order and moral appearance became central to their role. Rules were explicit and implicit. Curfews were common, especially for younger women. Late returns prompted questions or warnings. Visitors, particularly men, were restricted or forbidden. Even female guests could be subject to approval. These regulations were presented as protection, but they functioned primarily as control. Independence ended at the threshold. Observation was constant. Landladies noticed patterns: who came and went, who received letters, who skipped meals, who appeared anxious or tired. These details formed narratives, whether accurate or not. A woman's reputation within the house could shift quietly, based on interpretation rather than fact. The power imbalance was significant. Housing options were limited, and eviction could be sudden. A woman who challenged authority risked losing her room with little notice. This threat shaped behavior. Compliance was often the safer choice, even when rules felt intrusive or unfair. Moral standards were unevenly applied. Women perceived as respectable those with steady jobs, quiet habits, and modest appearance often received more leniency. Others faced stricter scrutiny. These judgments reinforced class and behavioral hierarchies within the house, shaping daily interactions. Communication between landladies and residents was rarely direct. Disapproval was conveyed subtly: a raised eyebrow, a pointed comment, a reminder of rules. Praise, when given, was equally understated. This indirectness created an atmosphere of uncertainty, where women learned to read signals carefully. Despite their authority, landladies were not simply villains. Many were themselves navigating economic precarity. Some offered quiet support, holding mail during difficult times, overlooking minor rule-breaking, or providing extra food during illness. These gestures were selective and discreet, reflecting personal judgment rather than policy. Still, the system reinforced surveillance. Women adjusted behavior preemptively, avoiding actions that might draw attention. Self-censorship became routine. Even within private rooms, awareness of oversight shaped choices, limiting spontaneity and expression. This environment blurred boundaries between public and private life. The boarding house was not a home in the traditional sense. It was a regulated space where personal conduct was subject to evaluation. For single women, this meant independence existed only within narrow parameters. The landlady's role reflected broader societal attitudes. Single women were seen as needing supervision, their morality considered fragile or suspect. Boarding house rules echoed workplace expectations and public scrutiny, creating a continuous chain of control. Yet women adapted. They learned how to appear compliant while preserving internal autonomy. Small acts, keeping thoughts private, forming discreet friendships, or finding solitude outside the house, allowed space for selfhood. Over time, relationships with landladies could soften. Familiarity bred predictability, if not warmth. Knowing what was tolerated and what was not reduced anxiety. Still, the underlying power dynamic remained. This quiet governance shaped daily life profoundly. It determined who felt safe, who felt watched, and who felt precarious. It influenced routines, relationships, and emotional well-being. The landlady's presence reminds us that control over women's lives did not always come from formal institutions. It operated through ordinary figures, embedded in everyday spaces. For single women in the 1930s, housing meant more than shelter. It meant submission to an unspoken code, enforced by someone whose approval could determine stability. Within these constraints, women endured. They complied where necessary, resisted where possible, and learned to live under observation without losing themselves entirely. The boarding house, governed by moral oversight, became another arena where resilience was tested. And in navigating this quiet authority, women demonstrated adaptability as crucial to survival as any wage earned. Beyond the boarding house, the office, and the city streets, single women in 1930s America faced a powerful force that shaped nearly every aspect of their lives: social judgment. Remaining unmarried past a certain age was not treated as a neutral circumstance. It was framed as a failure, a temporary condition to be corrected, or a warning sign. The label attached to single women carried assumptions that followed them everywhere. Marriage was presented as the expected destination of womanhood. Popular culture, family conversations, religious teachings, and workplace norms all reinforced the same message: a woman's stability, respectability, and future security were meant to come through a husband. Employment was described as preparation, not a path. Independence was tolerated only as an interim stage. For single women, this expectation translated into constant pressure. Questions were casual but persistent. When would they settle down? Whether they were seeing someone? Why they were still working? These inquiries appeared harmless on the surface, yet they carried judgment. Silence or vague answers often invited speculation, reinforcing the sense that a woman's private life was public property. The word spinster, though not always spoken aloud, hovered in the background. It implied loneliness, bitterness, and failure to attract a partner. It suggested something had gone wrong. Women were aware of this label and worked consciously to avoid it. They adjusted behavior, appearance, and even ambitions to remain within acceptable bounds. Family relationships intensified this pressure. Parents worried about financial security and social standing. Siblings married and moved on, while single women were expected to remain available emotionally, practically, sometimes financially. Visits home often included subtle reminders of what was missing rather than recognition of what had been achieved. Community scrutiny was equally influential. Neighbors noticed patterns. Church attendance, social events, and daily routines were observed. A woman living alone or in a boarding house attracted curiosity. Her movements, companions, and habits became topics of quiet discussion. Respectability required constant reinforcement. This scrutiny shaped choices around social life. Single women were cautious about where they went and with whom. Being seen too often with different companions risked reputational damage. Being seen too rarely raised questions of isolation. Balance was difficult to maintain, and mistakes were not easily forgiven. The emotional impact was cumulative. Constant evaluation eroded confidence. Even women who valued independence internalized doubts. Was something wrong with them? Were they falling behind? These thoughts did not always dominate, but they surfaced in moments of fatigue or disappointment. Dating during the Depression added complexity. Economic limitations restricted options. Outings were modest and infrequent. Social rules governed behavior closely. A woman had to appear interested but not eager, selective but not demanding. Too much independence could intimidate. Too much dependence could repel. The margin for error was narrow. Workplaces reinforced these norms. Single women were expected to be pleasant, modest, and non-threatening. Visible ambition could be interpreted as compensating for a lack of family life. Married women, when present, were often treated differently, their status lending legitimacy that single women lacked. Age intensified pressure. As years passed, concern sharpened. Opportunities were perceived to narrow. A woman in her 30s faced different assumptions than one in her early 20s. Time became a source of anxiety, not because of personal desire alone, but because of external judgment. Yet not all women experienced this pressure the same way. Some resisted quietly, choosing work and autonomy over marriage. Others hoped for partnership but refused to accept unsuitable arrangements. These choices were rarely celebrated. They were endured privately, without validation. Friendships among women provided critical support. Shared understanding softened isolation. Conversations allowed women to voice doubts and frustrations without fear of judgment. These relationships, though often undervalued, sustained emotional health. The contradiction at the heart of this stigma was clear. Society relied on single women's labor while questioning their legitimacy. It benefited from their work yet treated their independence as temporary or suspect. This inconsistency created tension that women navigated daily. Public narratives rarely acknowledged fulfillment outside marriage. Happiness was framed narrowly. As a result, single women learned to define success quietly, on their own terms, even when those terms went unrecognized. The stigma also shaped long-term planning. Many women delayed decisions, uncertain how their lives might change. Saving, relocation, or career shifts were approached cautiously. Stability felt provisional, always subject to potential marriage or economic disruption. Despite these pressures, single women continued to participate fully in social life. They attended events, contributed to communities, and supported families. Their presence was constant, even when their legitimacy was questioned. Over time, endurance bred perspective. Some women found peace in accepting uncertainty. Others redefined identity around work, friendship, or personal values. These adaptations did not erase stigma, but they lessened its power. The label of spinster reveals more about society's limitations than about the women it described. It exposed fear of independence and discomfort with women outside prescribed roles. Single women bore this burden quietly, often without complaint. Through judgment and expectation, they persisted. They built lives within narrow boundaries, negotiating dignity in a culture that offered conditional acceptance. Their resilience lay not in rejecting marriage outright, but in surviving a system that measured their worth by it. This social pressure shaped choices, emotions, and futures. It was invisible in policy but present in daily life. And yet, within its weight, single women continued working, supporting, adapting, refusing to disappear simply because they did not fit an ideal. Romantic life for single women in 1930s America unfolded under tight economic and social constraints. Dating existed, but it looked very different from the idealized versions promoted in films and magazines. Financial hardship, moral expectations, and public scrutiny shaped every interaction, narrowing the space for spontaneity or emotional risk. Money defined the boundaries of courtship. Lavish outings were rare. Most dates consisted of modest activities, walking through parks, sharing a simple drink, attending low-cost community events. These encounters were brief and carefully structured. The goal was not indulgence, but propriety. Every choice reflected awareness of cost and appearance. Public spaces dominated romantic interaction. Privacy was limited by necessity and reputation. Boarding house rules restricted visitors. Renting private spaces was financially impossible and socially risky. As a result, relationships developed slowly, under observation. Intimacy was postponed, sometimes indefinitely, constrained by circumstance rather than desire. Women navigated complex expectations. They were encouraged to be agreeable but cautious, open yet restrained. Expressing too much interest risked being judged as imprudent. Showing too little risked appearing indifferent. Each interaction required calibration, shaped by cultural norms rather than personal preference. Economic instability heightened uncertainty. A potential partner's employment status mattered deeply. Job loss could derail prospects entirely. Women weighed affection against practicality, aware that emotional connection alone could not guarantee stability. Romance was filtered through the lens of survival. Social class influenced opportunity. Women with steady office work or supportive families had more flexibility. Those in precarious positions faced narrower options. Dating was not just about compatibility. It was about alignment of circumstance. Despite constraints, emotional connection mattered. Shared conversations, humor, and companionship provided relief from daily pressure. Even modest outings offered moments of normalcy and hope. These experiences, though limited, were meaningful. Yet disappointment was common. Many relationships stalled due to external pressures. Economic hardship, family expectations, or geographic separation intervened. Women learned to manage expectations, balancing hope with realism. The fear of judgment loomed. Reputation remained fragile. Being seen with different companions or appearing too frequently in public raised questions. Women protected their standing carefully, often at the expense of exploration. Some women chose to withdraw from dating altogether, prioritizing stability and autonomy. Others persisted, accepting limitations as part of the era's reality. Neither choice was simple or celebrated. In this environment, romance was cautious, measured, and often unresolved. It reflected broader social constraints rather than individual failure. Single women navigated it with resilience, seeking connection within narrow confines. These frugal, restrained relationships illustrate how deeply economic and social conditions shaped personal life. Love existed, but it had to fit within the boundaries of scarcity and expectation. Amid economic pressure, social judgment, and constant surveillance, single women in 1930s America developed forms of strength that rarely appeared in public narratives. Their resilience was not loud or dramatic. It unfolded quietly through endurance, adaptability, and the support they offered one another in spaces where formal systems failed them. Friendship among women became a crucial lifeline. In boarding houses, workplaces, and neighborhoods, women formed bonds grounded in shared experience rather than sentimentality. These relationships were practical and emotionally sustaining. Advice was exchanged discreetly about employers, housing, safe routes through the city, or ways to stretch limited income. Information itself became a resource. Solidarity often appeared in small gestures. A coat lent during cold weather. A meal quietly shared when wages ran short. Someone covering a shift, or offering an explanation to a supervisor. These acts were rarely acknowledged openly, but they mattered deeply. They reduced isolation and reminded women that hardship was not a personal failure. Conversation played a powerful role. In trusted company, women could speak honestly about fear, frustration, and uncertainty. These moments of openness were limited, but they provided relief. Being understood by someone who shared the same constraints validated experience in a society that dismissed it. Resilience also showed in adaptation. Women learned how to manage exhaustion, disappointment, and pressure without visible collapse. Emotional regulation was a skill honed through necessity. Feelings were not denied, but they were contained. This capacity allowed women to function in environments that offered little flexibility. Workplaces, though competitive, sometimes fostered mutual support. Colleagues exchanged tips, shared workloads quietly, and protected one another when possible. Cooperation existed alongside caution. Solidarity did not erase competition, but it softened its impact. These networks extended beyond immediate circles. Churches, clubs, and informal groups offered connection and purpose. Participation provided structure and belonging, even when resources were limited. These spaces allowed women to contribute, be seen, and maintain identity beyond work and housing. Resilience was also internal. Many women developed strong personal values that guided decisions. Self-respect, responsibility, and perseverance shaped identity. These qualities were cultivated intentionally, serving as anchors amid instability. Importantly, resilience did not mean absence of struggle. Fatigue, doubt, and loneliness were common. Strength existed alongside vulnerability. What distinguished these women was not immunity to hardship, but the ability to continue despite it. Society rarely recognized this strength. Public narratives focused on dependence or deficiency. Single women's endurance was normalized rather than celebrated. Yet it sustained households, workplaces, and communities. Through quiet cooperation and emotional intelligence, women created informal systems of care. These systems compensated for gaps left by economic and social institutions. They were fragile but effective, rooted in trust and shared understanding. This invisible strength shaped daily survival. It allowed women to maintain dignity, preserve hope, and navigate uncertainty. Though overlooked, it was foundational. The story of single women in the 1930s is incomplete without acknowledging this resilience. It reveals a capacity for solidarity that thrived under constraint, offering a powerful counterpoint to narratives of isolation and failure. In enduring together, women affirmed one another's worth, often the only recognition available. The lives of single women in 1930s America did not end quietly in history, even if their stories were rarely recorded. What they endured, adapted to, and quietly reshaped became part of the invisible foundation of modern female independence. Their legacy is not found in headlines or monuments, but in normalized freedoms that later generations inherited without always knowing the cost. At the time, single women were often treated as temporary figures, women assumed to be waiting, failing, or passing through life until marriage corrected their status. Yet many never married, not out of rebellion, but circumstance. Economic instability, lost partners after war or illness, family obligations, or simple lack of opportunity shaped realities. Despite this, they built full lives within narrow margins. Identity for these women was constantly negotiated. Society offered limited acceptable roles, and none were designed for long-term independence. Women learned to define themselves internally when external validation was absent or conditional. Character, reliability, and self-sufficiency became core markers of worth, even when no one applauded them. This internal identity carried forward. The habit of self-reliance, developed under pressure, shaped how women approached work, money, and relationships in later decades. The idea that a woman could manage her own life even imperfectly slowly became less radical because so many already had. Their economic participation mattered. Single women filled offices, shops, schools, and factories. They kept systems running during a period of national instability. Their wages, though small, supported families, landlords, businesses, and local economies. Over time, this normalized women's presence in the workforce beyond temporary necessity. The boundaries they navigated also clarified injustice. Being subject to scrutiny, dismissal, and unequal standards exposed the flaws in social systems. Though they often lacked the power to challenge these systems directly, their endurance revealed contradictions that later reform movements would confront more openly. Cultural expectations shifted gradually. What had once been scandalous, living alone, working long-term, delaying marriage, became less shocking as it became more common. Change did not happen through confrontation alone, but through repetition. The visibility of women surviving independently altered perception. Their emotional independence also left a mark. Many learned to build fulfillment outside traditional romance. Friendship, purpose, routine, and personal pride became meaningful sources of stability. This broadened the understanding of what a complete life could look like for a woman. Later generations benefited from these quiet expansions of possibility. The right to work, rent, travel, and remain unmarried without automatic disgrace did not appear suddenly. They were layered atop decades of lived precedent set by women who had no choice but to persist. Importantly, these women were not symbols to themselves. They were simply trying to get through the day. Yet history is shaped as much by necessity as by intention. Survival itself became contribution. Their legacy also complicates nostalgia. The era is often remembered through stylized imagery, but beneath it lay rigid expectations and relentless judgment. Remembering these women honestly challenges romanticized versions of the past and honors resilience without glorification. Modern independence rests on their endurance. The freedom to choose partnership rather than require it owes something to women who were denied that choice entirely. Their lives proved that womanhood was not invalid without marriage, even when society insisted otherwise. They passed down practical wisdom, financial caution, emotional boundaries, adaptability, sometimes directly through family, sometimes indirectly through example. These traits became embedded in cultural norms. Though unnamed, their influence persists. In every assumption that a woman can live alone, support herself, or define her own timeline, their shadow remains. The story of single women in 1930s America is not one of tragedy alone. It is a story of persistence without applause, of dignity under constraint, and of quiet transformation. Their strength reshaped expectations not by declaration, but by endurance. They lived lives that mattered, even when the world failed to acknowledge it. As this story comes to an end, what remains is not a single name or moment, but a broader understanding of how quiet lives can shape history. The women we have explored were not seeking recognition, change, or validation. They were navigating the limits of their time with the tools they had, often unseen, often unacknowledged. Yet their daily choices, working, surviving, adapting, slowly widened the boundaries of what society would later accept. Their experiences remind us that progress is not always loud or immediate. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, through repetition, endurance, and ordinary persistence. The freedoms that feel natural today were built on years of invisible effort by people who never imagined their lives would matter beyond their own survival. By revisiting stories like these, we do not just look back, we gain clarity about the present. Understanding where independence truly began helps us recognize its value and the cost at which it came. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If you found it meaningful, take a moment to reflect on the lives history rarely pauses to remember. And as always, thank you for watching. See you in the next story.